I'm Tim Harrington. I'm the vice chair of the club here, and I'd like to welcome you to these rather impressive surroundings, which I'm sure you will have some time to look around in more detail today. Just to say why we are called the National Liberal Club with a large L. That actually reflects our heritage, founded by Gladstone in 1882, and many events in liberal politics over the years have revolved around this club. But these days things are different. We are very much liberal with a small L in terms of the sort of membership we have. So you don't have to be liberal with a large L to join. All we ask is that you identify with the club's values and ethos. That is, that you are a small L liberal, which means that you identify with the usual values of a liberal democracy: respect for democratic institutions, acting courteously, open-minded, tolerant, respect for diversity. Those sort of values, I'm sure we will see on display in good humour here today. And if you look at our website, you'll see a wide variety of events, from the purely social to those that seek to advance political, cultural and intellectual debate, which is a key objective of this club, and your event today is a final example of the latter. So I do hope you get a chance to look around, and you may even think that this is a nice place to join. There'll be plenty of application forms down in the lobby if it takes your interest. Do in particular, if you get a chance, go onto the terrace, which on a day like this is quite magnificent, looking over the river, and that may well tempt you to come back again. So I wish you a successful day here at the club and hope to see many of you back here again soon. And thank you for coming.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim. And believe me, I am a liberal, and those who don't believe me, I'll see you later. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Measuring the Economy. My name is Tony Dent. I'm a director of Better Statistics Community Interest Company, and I am a statistician. It's my pleasure to introduce today and our keynote speaker, James Benford, from the Office for National Statistics. James, on the other hand, not being a statistician, is actually an economist. One of my favourite things about explaining statisticians is they're people who like numbers but haven't got the intelligence to be an economist. Anyway, of course, the main difference between an economist and a statistician is that the former is someone who explores the past in depth in order to hope to predict the future, whereas a statistician is a poor chap stuck trying to understand the present. Anyway, I'm sure you'll discover that James is also very much concerned with the present, and that he and I share a concern for the misunderstanding created by the use of the phrase lies, damned lies, and statistics. We've all heard that phrase, probably many times. It was even used by Sir Simon Hoare, MP, when, as the chair of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, he introduced PACAC's inquiry into the performance and governance of the UK Statistics Authority last July. In my personal opinion, the inference that statistics are just another form of lie is itself a lie, may even be a damned lie, because a lie normally is a very personal affair, chosen to ensure some personal gain or often to avoid some unpleasant consequence of a misadventure. A damned lie, on the other hand, is a public matter, often causing reputational damage to an individual or an institution. And the idea that statistics may be a form of damned lie is itself a damned lie, in my opinion, because statistics is an entirely different matter. Every statistic produced by the ONS and others has been produced using a precise method for a specific purpose. It's not just made up. Unfortunately, no statistic is ever immutable. It doesn't contain the whole truth. Normally, there are sufficiently accurate representations of the truth to suit the purpose for which they were designed to achieve. In fact, all statistics result from some form of measurement, whether the statistic is the length of a piece of wood or the number of persons who get up before 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. We need a method to measure it. Measuring a long piece of wood with a 1-foot ruler is likely to yield an estimate less accurate than if we'd used a tape measure, but it might be good enough for some purposes. My watch, like Big Ben's clock, is perfectly adequate for day-to-day purposes, but we would need an atomic clock to calibrate a journey to the moon. Measuring the number of people getting up before 7 a.m. on a Tuesday is a somewhat more complicated process because, unlike the length of a piece of wood or even time, it can't be measured through any observational method, at least not yet, although I understand that the Chinese may soon be able to do that for their population and indeed our own, who knows. But here in the UK, we need the cooperation of the people to measure that statistic through asking them to record the facts themselves, either directly or through some form of question and answer survey. Which brings me to today. The fact is that the difficulties which have led to the Devra report and the pay gap inquiry had a disarmingly simple underlying cause. It was that many of the people we were relying upon to continue to provide us with information just stopped doing so. So the authority, the ONS, and indeed lots of other people, are unable to measure how many people are getting up in the morning to go to work and how many are staying in bed. They're not telling us. At first it was believed that more sophisticated Bayesian methods could overcome the difficulty, particularly if supported by administrative data. But response rates got worse, so the difficulties became greater, and even the work done at pace was unable to conceal the fact that the results are no longer of a sufficient standard to be considered reliable. That's the context in which the pay gap report inquiry is taking place, and indeed James was appointed. It may be some consolation to know that similar problems have been experienced in most other countries. This week, for example, the Belgian Statistics Authority actually had to say, well, we're not going to publish our consumer price index this week. We've got some difficulties there. So there you go. Anyway, the focus for today's seminar is to investigate how we can get business in the United Kingdom to be more cooperative with the Office for National Statistics for their mutual benefit and for our all. So I'm delighted to introduce James Benford as our keynote speaker. James was appointed to the new post of Director General for Surveys and Economic Statistics last August, and his impact is evidenced by the support he has given to this seminar in particular, in addition to his responsibilities for delivering the plans prepared for the Devra report last year. Prior to joining the ONS, James had a distinguished career at the Bank of England, where he'd been Executive Director for Data Analytics Transformation, contributing to modernising data and artificial intelligence capabilities, whatever they may be, enabling innovative approaches to statistical and regulatory data collection and analysis. James has also served as Director of the Economics Group at Her Majesty's Treasury, His Majesty's Treasury, my apologies, Director of Analysis at the Joint Biosecurity Centre, and as Private Secretary to Governors Mark Carney and Andrew Bailey. So I guess he knows how to keep a secret or two. However, I'm assured that he will keep no secrets from us as he explains the details of gross domestic product, where we are and where we may be going, and how business can contribute. Thank you, James. I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Tony, for that very kind introduction. I'm only 9 months into the ONS, but one point I have come to appreciate even more is that economists have a lot to learn from statisticians. Indeed, I've already learnt a lot from you. Thanks for bringing us together today and the work that you and Better Statistics are doing to strengthen engagement, particularly with the business community, but more broadly with users of statistics, it is making a difference, and I'll come back to that in a moment. My topic today is GDP, gross domestic product. It's always difficult to pick a favourite child, but if I had to pick a favourite statistic, GDP would be mine. It's the basis for how we compare ourselves internationally. It tells us that the UK economy, at around £3 trillion nominally, is the 5th largest in the world. Per person, that's around £45,000 annually, putting the UK at around 21st on that measure of living standards. The Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility, my old employers, the Bank of England, all use it as a basis for their work on fiscal and monetary policy. It sits at the heart of economic decision making. But, and this is a key point, the key point perhaps, it's not something that we observe, it's something that we build. GDP summarises an entire system of measurement, a system of national accounts that brings together everything we produce, we earn, we spend into a single coherent picture of our economy. It's a system that all of us are part of. We collectively generate the data that underpins it. And at the ONS, it's our job to bring that data together, to challenge it and improve the system so that we can produce the best collective view at that point in time of where the economy is. I'll try and explain how we do that and how it necessarily involves a set of figures that update over time or are revised over time. That's a feature, not a bug, and how we draw in more data sets as we do. Given recent interest, I think I also need to talk through how we adjust for changing seasons. I'll also get into the agenda going forward, how we're going to improve that system of measurements, and how you can get involved too. So, as I said, calculating GDP is quite a different task to many other types of statistics. The job is to integrate many, in fact over 400 different data sources on output, expenditure and income, which of course should all add up to the same three, those three concepts should add up to the same number to reflect back a comprehensive and cohesive picture of the economy. In addition to over 70 household and business surveys, I'll come on to the business surveys in a moment, we draw together 25 data sets from the tax system, over 140 broader data sets from other government departments, and around 180 commercial and regulatory data sets, including some from my old employers at the Bank of England. Reflecting lags in collection, of course, the data available builds up over time. At the start, and I'll come on to this, we are very reliant on our monthly business surveys, but as we bring in more data, we can update that picture. At the start, we focus on output measures, but as we get in more data from the tax system, in particular, income and expenditure come into focus more sharply, and we base our measurements, our estimates on an average of the three. So I did say that business is critical to this process, to the timeliness, the breadth and depth of what we can produce. In the ONS, we run 74 business surveys, 65 of which contribute to our suite of economic outputs that feed the system of national accounts. We also run some on behalf of government departments, for example. We send out 2.5 million questionnaires each year. 2.2 of those are now digital first and online, and plans are in train, I'll come on to this, to take the remaining 300,000 or so online too. We sample around 345,000 firms a year, around 13% of our current business register. Come back to that too. Our samples are stratified so that the larger firms that cover a significant amount of economic activity are surveyed pretty much every time. But of those 300 or so thousand firms that we survey, 70% are only approached to ask to fill in one survey. We are working to consolidate our surveys to reduce that total towards a number that's more like 40 for the business surveys, and to see what we can, how we can complement it or even substitute what we collect from surveys with wider data sources in government. But, and this is a crucial point, I think that work can only go so far. For example, it's our monthly business survey that gives us a read on business turnover for January by early March. and we wouldn't get that same data on turnover from VAT receipts until around the middle of this year. So we really do need those surveys to have the early picture on what's going on. And when we come to the more granular account for our national accounts and need to work through not just gross outputs, but gross value added, and adjust for intermediate inputs, we need to draw on our suite of annual and structural business surveys. So I've drawn together in this slide, it's a bit complicated, bear with me, I'll go through the columns. Basically, the system, the cycle that we run through to produce GDP. It's been through various iterations since we first started in the 1950s, and the current configuration has been in place for around 8 years, following the Bean Review, which is when we introduced the first set of monthly releases for GDP in July 2018. Our ability to produce a monthly estimate, as I said, stems from the strength of our business surveys, and they capture 80% of turnover in the economy with the very first set of returns. And that figure will rise within 3 months when we capture late returns towards 97%, but it is really quite a strong read from the off. Only Canada, I think, runs a comparable system. It means that by early April, we had a first estimate of 3-month on 3-month growth in February of 0.5%, telling us that we are expecting a strong first quarter, which the bank noted when they met this week. So when we work through those sets of monthly releases, and then by the 3rd month of the quarter, of course, we get to a first quarterly estimate. We'll produce that, a first quarterly estimate for GDP on the 13th of May, and at that point in time, it will actually already incorporate 80% of the information that we will have with the fullness of time on output. With the second estimate that will come in June, we're up to 90% on output, 75% on sources of information on expenditure, 85% for income, just showing how the system builds up over time. The final part of our cycle comes every year with the Blue Book, which will come in October this year, and that's when we incorporate information from our annual business surveys covering 2024, and it's the first time when we produce the first balance estimate across the accounts. What that means is we work through over 100 industries, 100 different product types, how much is produced, how much is consumed as part of production, net exports, and how much is consumed finally as domestic consumption. And we reconcile that those sources of supply and use add up, and that's what gives us a more coherent, cohesive set of estimates. We do that each year. We also, with the Blue Book, improve our methodology. Last year, we brought in a much better estimate, more comprehensive of R&D in the economy, and we improved how we account for the pharmaceutical sector, in particular the offshoring in that sector, which we remain having an economic stake in that activity. So we brought some of that activity back into GDP. This year, we'll be bringing in better admin data on household income, improving our measure of housing services and rental income, and bringing in enhanced product-level data in the service sector from our expanded annual surveys of goods and services. Subsequent Blue Books will bring in further data sources, for example, the self-assessed tax system and the corporate profits return to HMRC come in with a lag of 18 months to 2 years, and so will not be brought in until future Blue Books. A core feature of that system is in this chart, revisions, updates to GDP. So the chart you can see here just shows the first initial estimate of quarterly growth in the dark blue bars, and then the swathe shows the whole range of estimates of revisions to growth over the next 3 years. So that is the feature I mentioned. As we get more information, we revise our estimates. There's a few things I'd like to pull out of the chart. The first is the two periods where I've circled. So the global financial crisis and the COVID period, where you can see that the range of revisions is much bigger. In fact, if you look across the sample as a whole, the average growth rate is 0.3%. The average revision between the first estimate and the final estimate 3 years later is 0.1 percentage points. So it does round to 0.1, although it is statistically insignificant from 0. And the average absolute revision, ignoring the sign, is 0.3. However, if you take out recessions and recovery periods, you get quite a different picture. The average growth rate is 0.5%. The average revision between first and final rounds to 0 now, rather than 0.1, and the average absolute revision is 0.2. That reflects the fact that when we're in recession and recovery periods, the economy is changing a lot by whatever shock has hit it, and some of the relationships that we're assuming in producing our estimates are changing in ways that we can't immediately see at the time. It also reflects, and I'll come on to this, in the most recent period, we've actually made some quite, by coincidence, big methods changes through the COVID recession and recovery. So I just thought I'd talk you through, because it has received some attention in the press, just how we have revised our estimates of the shape of the recovery through COVID over time. We can circulate these slides afterwards, so you don't have to read all the detail right now. But the point is there's two big changes that come through. The first is increased data available. So in 2021, when we're looking back to 2020, we begin to complement that data from the monthly business surveys with VAT information and annual benchmarks for trade and services and FDI. In 2022, we do the first supply-use balance of 2020, and so it works through. But we have also been, through this period, introducing big methods improvements. And we do these things, we bring in more data, and we do those methods improvements at the same time. And so sometimes it can be difficult to appreciate the contribution of each. I'll come back to that. We've brought in so-called double deflation, which is one of the recommendations from the Bean Review. We've improved our methods for insurance companies and pension schemes. We've improved our methods for accounting for global supply chains and deflators in the telecom sector. And I already touched on R&D in pharmaceuticals. So this is how it looks. This is how the estimate for the cumulative GDP growth at different points, I'll talk you through the chart, changes over time as we bring in more information and as we change those methods. So this line here at the bottom, end 2020, says that at the start of 2021, when we had our first estimate for GDP, the level of GDP at the end of 20, that was down roughly 8% on the pre-COVID level. And you can see as more data came in, we began to revise up GDP and revise down the size of that fall. But then with the first Blue Book, methods changes in the main and the first balancing process actually made the fall even bigger. When we get to the end, the fall actually is pretty much intact with where things started. So we dropped by around 8%, and then in the very latest data, that drop is 0.15 percentage points higher than it was when we first made that estimate. So it's pretty much the same. The big story, therefore, in what's been happening with GDP over time and therefore this revision up is all about the strength of the recovery. It's borne out most by the purple line here for end 2022, the blue line for end 2022, where the cumulative growth to end 2022 from the start of COVID is up 3.5 percentage points to where things started in 2024. That's reflecting basically two things. One is the extra information we get on what's called intermediate inputs as the annual survey data becomes available, and we're able to do that balancing process. And what we found was actually through the recovery from COVID, companies economized on those inputs. And so our previous assumption that the ratio of gross output to intermediate inputs was constant was wrong. And so when we brought in that extra data, we found a stronger recovery. The extra data that we brought in, I think, accounts for roughly half of the extra strength we found in GDP. The other half is all those methods changes. We knew for some time that our R&D surveys did not match what we're seeing in the admin data, and we brought one in line with the other, and that lifted GDP. And we brought in, for example, some of the global supply chains from the pharmaceutical sector, and made some broader adjustments to the level of stock building in the economy. All of that lifted the level of output. What do I conclude from this? And this is something where we are learning over time and evolving what we do over time. It's very important to be as transparent as we can be about the methods changes we're putting through and how the new data will affect the estimates as we bring them in, and how they do affect the estimates. We try to do that each year by setting out an article on the scope of that year's Blue Book, and having a special article in the summer bringing out exactly what those methods changes are doing, so people can see and anticipate the changes that are coming. But that's how we incorporate the additional information and improved methods. I said I would do the seasons. So I've shown on the left-hand side chart here in red what happens if you just look at the level of quarterly GDP, unadjusted, no seasonal adjustments whatsoever. And you can see it really is very significantly seasonal. And so we're doing a lot of work on seasonal adjustments. Just look at those growth rates on the right-hand side for non-seasonally adjusted GDP. You get growth rates of over 3% quarter to quarter, and falls of almost 3% quarter to quarter sometimes too. There's a regular pattern where GDP increases towards the end of the year, the run up to Christmas, and then year-end effects as people try and often bunch spending before the end of the year, and then it falls sharply at the start of the year. But the other thing you can see is that seasonal pattern, and I'll come on to this so we can look at it in more detail, is changing. Whereas at the start of the period, there was really quite sharp falls in the first quarter. By the end, the fall is quite small. The way we adjust for those seasonal variations in GDP does actually allow for seasonal patterns to change over time. We published an article on this last autumn, and I've shown one output in that article in this slide here, which just shows the seasonal factor estimated for quarter one, the top left, quarter two, top right, quarter three, quarter four. And what you can see, particularly for quarter one, is a really quite sharp increase in the seasonal factor that we've seen since COVID. I don't think you've seen as sharp movements in the estimated seasonal factors since perhaps the 1990s. So this hasn't happened for some time. There's various reasons that could be. Working from home is possible. That could change the pattern of economic activity over the course of the year. One reason which I'm sure is part of it, it's reflected in what businesses tell us themselves, is the move to a single budget rather than two events in the autumn, combined with the fact that the economy has emerged from COVID with a lot of public debt and a higher deficit, and so there has tended to be a lot of speculation around all budgets, around the direction and location of fiscal tightening. We had reported to us last year that a lot of companies were, quotes, waiting for the budget before deciding on employment and investment decisions. That's tended to result in slightly weaker activity in the autumn, and then a bounce back in terms of growth in Q1. This chart, these tables bring that out even more. So table 1 corresponds to that really volatile line that I showed you before for non-seasonally adjusted GDP growth. And what I've done is just show you the average for that quarterly growth rate in 2018, 2019, the 2 years before COVID, to the last 2 years, 24 and 25. So without our seasonal adjustments, what you see is that before COVID, and this is a typical pattern if you go back to other years too, there was that big fall, a big fall in non-seasonally adjusted GDP of 3.4% in the first quarter. The average for the last 2 years has been a fall of just 0.9%. And so in non-seasonally adjusted terms, that quarterly growth rate is 2.6 percentage points stronger. That's a massive number for a quarterly variation in GDP. Table 2 shows you what happens on our seasonally adjusted data. Before COVID, the average for growth in Q1 was 0.3, and after, and this has been commented on by many, with our seasonal adjustments, it's 0.7. So the increase in the growth rate, once we seasonal adjust, is 0.4 percentage points. Put differently, we've absorbed in changes of our through changes in our seasonal adjustments, 85% of the increased, the change in seasonal pattern that we've observed. The debate is about whether we've gone far enough, basically. And I think personally it's very hard to tell. And through any filter, it is looking basically at a moving average of the last 3 to 5 years. And when seasonal patterns are changing, it will take time for the seasonal factor to catch up. I know and I'm confident that we are using international practice. We've had that reviewed by the OSR, and we've asked the University of Southampton to do their own in-depth review of what we're doing. We'll publish an article on seasonal adjustments in May ahead of the Q1 release to make that clear too. But it's obviously an area that we need to keep under continuous review, and we will do exactly that. So to say a bit about what we're doing to make the system of national accounts and our GDP estimates better. There's 4 main parts to that. We're strengthening our survey infrastructure. We're improving our data collection processes and how we engage with businesses. And we're seeking to improve the quality of GDP and the relevance of GDP through implementing new international standards. We're also keeping an eye on the horizon, what's going on. It's not so much on the horizon, it's right in front of us, including thinking about what AI means for the statistics. Just a brief word on each of those 4 things. So with the new statistical business register, we will nearly double the coverage in our register from around 3.1 million firms currently to 5.5 million once we bring in a lot of micro businesses. We'll also greatly enhance the system's functionality. We just published in the last month the results from our consultation on how the UK will implement the new standard industrial classifications, and we actually need that enhanced statistical business register to implement that. We've started some live sampling from the register already. We're proceeding iteratively, therefore, for 6 of our surveys, and we've begun to bring more data into it. Over the next year, we will transition more data, including HMRC self-assessment data, onto the register, bring in more surveys to sample from it, and we'll map how businesses correspond to the new set of SIC codes. And over the following 2 years or so, we will bring the SPR into full adoption. We're working to 2031 to bring in the new SIC codes fully. This is quite a complex process with a lot of systems changes that have to be worked through sequentially. We're doing a lot, actually, to improve the way we run our business surveys, engage with businesses. We had the board meeting just yesterday, and the board noted that the average response rate spot across all our business surveys had reached close to a record high. That reflects great work to make our surveys digital and more easy to complete, where we've just achieved, actually over the last month, bringing the ASH survey online. So that's a further 125,000 businesses surveyed in that survey, which takes away broadly about half of the tail of paper surveys that we had to work through. We're working to expand our large case and account management units. And these have been really important in enhancing the quality of data we get from large and complex organisations. And at Tony's initiation, actually, we have just launched have launched a business survey, engagement survey, which will close next week. We've had some responses, around 60 or so. The themes are interesting, though. I'd say the top 3 are relationships matter. Please get to know the businesses that you're surveying, and that's all about building on those large case and account management approaches. Do more, and this is an interesting one, to play back our statistics back to the firms, and we'll think about how we could do that. And a very simple thing that I'm sure we will do, lots of respondents just want a simple survey calendar that they can subscribe to. So that's what I meant when I said that Better Statistics are already making a difference. We wouldn't have done that survey, we wouldn't be doing those things had you not suggested it. We're improving, as I said, the quality and relevance of GDP. The jelly's not set yet on this one, and we will, in July, update our plans, and this engagement today can help inform what we do. One thing that we are looking to do is to enhance how we balance conflicting data sources and improve how we do that, and how we can introduce a consistent set of labour market accounts to complement the national accounts. We're looking to bring in earlier use of real-time indicators and alternative data sources like scanner data into GDP as well as prices. And we're working through more broadly where to go next on beyond GDP. A big and pretty complex programme of work is to implement the new international standards that were agreed last year, so-called SNA 25 and the Balance of Payments Manual 7. That's an agreed priority for the office, and our ambition is to implement it, the core of those standards, by 2030, 2031. Briefly on AI, you can find a lot on AI in our surveys already. It's a regular feature in the BICS fortnightly survey to firms, where we can see 40% of large firms are using it, 25% of all firms are using it, and we've got a lot of granular detail now on how, which sectors, what type of occupations. We're also asking questions about AI in our household surveys, including on time use. I think there are quite big questions about what AI means for how we measure the economy. For example, AI we think of as part of software, but how do you measure investment in software when it writes its own software? There's long been a question about free digital goods, freely available digital goods. So email, for example, Wikipedia on the internet. By definition, these are outside the scope of GDP. My guess is, given what AI is doing and its universal availability, it will greatly expand the supply of freely available digital goods, leading to questions about how we measure that part of the economy that at the moment is not part of GDP. We're engaged with international stakeholders to align with their thinking and remain at the forefront of best practice on that. To conclude, when you look at GDP, whether it's that 0.3% average quarterly growth rate or the £3 trillion headline, do not see a single number. See the system that sits behind it, a system of national accounts that brings together millions of data points reflecting transactions and decisions across our economy, a system that evolves because we feed in more data, better data, we improve our methods, because the economy itself, even the seasons, are changing. Statistics are not produced in isolation, they are built collectively. It's a team sport. Every response to our surveys, every data set that is shared, every assumption is challenged, every user need given to us, these all shape the quality of what we produce, what we're able to do. Businesses in particular are central to all of that. Without their data and engagement, we simply could not produce GDP with the speed, accuracy and granularity that the country demands and relies upon. At the ONS, we are refining what are quite ambitious plans to improve the quality of economic statistics, and will publish an updated set in July. They're not a finished product, and they are there to be shaped. This is therefore a moment to engage, to tell us where the system should go next, to help us make it stronger. Because, as Tony and I both like to say, your national statistics need you. Thank you very much.
Well, first say that that was far more illuminating and interesting than chapter 24 of Cairncross 60 years ago. One of your particular slides worried me because you talked about showing differences in recovery, or rather increases in income, but not in expenditure. This seems to me rather biased. In the same way, 2 slides earlier, when you were talking about the revisions not being significantly different from zero, except for recessions and recoveries, the thing is, some of the recession and recovery numbers, the differences are quite large. And the thing is, positive 1%, negative 1% are as bad as one another. They don't just cancel out to zero.
Yeah, so I think it's like a, thanks for the question. It's definitely a fair challenge, and you know, with every update to our previous estimate, we do need to, and the general pattern of those, we do need to learn from them. I know, speaking to colleagues at the ONS, that we certainly have done that already for the global financial crisis, where a lot of that was about the forecasting measures that we used, that we're less reliant on now because we have brought in more from that monthly business survey. A big part of the data in data story in the last recession recovery was, I think, due to that assumption of a constant share of intermediate inputs in gross output. Whether that the behaviour of that is always the same in every recession recovery is hard to tell. We've only got 2 recessions and recovery in that period, but it is an area where we're looking to get more timely data sources on and to learn from as well. So I think it's a fair observation that you know, my illustration of the data shows that those bigger revisions and sometimes in one direction is concentrated in recovery and recession periods is something we need to learn from, and we will.
Sorry, there's a gentleman there. Yes, sorry, you had your hand up first. So can you say who you are, please?
Yes, I'm John Bryant. I'm a member here, and I'm thankfully retired, so I don't have to do business stuff anymore. My concern is about what ONS misses in its various collections of surveys and what HMRC never find out about either, which is still part of the economy, which is the worker who is cash in hand. Therefore, HMRC never finds out about their income. And also the proceeds of sales of second-hand goods, collectibles, houses. How do you, as an organisation, the ONS, count what would be the proceeds of that informal economy into the consumption figures which you are collecting from retail businesses? So there must be a gap between money actually spent and the money which we can find is being received by employees officially. So there is that gap, and does that actually influence your quarterly variations? Okay,
so we do make assumptions, informed assumptions about data on the sometimes called the grey economy, including all the way up to assumptions on activity which may relate to tax evasion. And so we do have assumptions on the accounts in there. I mean, inherently it's an area where to try and measure quarter by quarter what's happening on there is by definition difficult, but we do try and factor that into the figures. In terms of exchanges of second-hand goods, I mean, the approach in GDP is to measure the value of what's produced, and the value related to that. There sometimes will be some intermediation services that support the exchange of second-hand goods, and we will seek to capture that. We won't count the same thing many times because it's changed hands. Does that help?
What kind of percentage do you think is in the informal economy which you can't count properly?
I haven't got off the top of my head a figure for that, but I could get one from the team, but I haven't got one right now. but I could get one for you.
Sorry, Mr. Price first. Yes.
Vicky Price. Can I just ask on the seasonal adjustments?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there's crisis after crisis,
Yes.
and there are emergency measures put by the government, lots of extra spending which may be affecting things
Yes.
in the future. Given that we had such a long period of crisis, how confident are you about the seasonal adjustments? And also you did mention the fact that the budget is changing in terms of the timing.
Yes.
There's only one. And what we've seen, of course, I think as you hinted, is a complete change in terms of the way that the economy works, which is basically flat before the budget, and then recovering in the first few months of the year,
Yes.
then going flat again, trying to worry about the next budget, on top of all the other crises we've got. So how is that influenced? I mean, can we really trust this?
So, okay, so a few things in that. So, the way the models that were used to filter through the data and discern the seasonal patterns work is roughly on a kind of average of the past 3 to 5 years, with more weight on the past 3. So they will naturally, if you have a sudden break in the seasonal adjustment, take a bit of time to catch up with that. We're like 2025 going to 2026 now, and so quite a lot of the adjustment ought to have happened. One tricky thing though is the point I mentioned and you referred to in terms of the influence of the combination of the changed timing in budget and the fiscal position emerging from COVID, and exactly that tendency which has been reported to us, commented on by the Bank of England too, is nothing specific to us, that companies have pointed to as affecting their decisions running into the autumn and unwinding to the first quarter. Like, our seasonal adjustments will be picking that up, and that the fact that we're absorbing 85% of that extra activity that we're finding in Q1 now is one measure of that. So whether that's enough, time will tell. I mean, I don't. I mean, if you have a different method that we could be doing right now, happy to try it. But my instinct is this is something we just have to continue looking at and see how the patterns change and let that pick up in the filter. And it's also perfectly possible here that we've been through an unusual period in terms of the adjustment to where the economy was coming out of COVID, and things could be different going forward. So it's not. We are following best practice, but this is not a completely precise and exact science.
Yes, can we just have one more question, please? Okay, yes, please. And then we must move on to the next section. Sorry, there are two competing. Can you? The next session is about revision.
Thanks, a really interesting presentation. It really showed the richness of the data sets that are coming into the ONS about businesses. And I was just wondering what the possibilities are around data linking within your setup, because it might give a very unique perspective on businesses, especially the most innovative and sectors, or the ones that the UK are particularly strong at, where you can see dynamism and measuring challenges.
Yeah.
And especially sectors where we export, where your picture is possibly quite harder to perform.
So there's a lot of potential in data linkage. One particularly promising project, which is quite a broad collaboration actually, is the so-called LEAD work, which is to link data on employees and employers. We have that data set and we're doing research on it and we're building on it. We did publish some research on it last year actually, in terms of looking through what it says about productivity and then higher productivity for exporters and higher growth in productivity for exporters. So there's a lot of potential there, not just for GDP concepts like productivity, but also I think linked data offers a lot to delve into some of the challenges in labour market statistics too. But it's a good area, and happy to talk more on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, James.
And we have not just one distinguished Liz for you, but two. That's very good. Liz Barclay is perhaps best known as a broadcaster and journalist. She's relevant to today, has special interest in SMEs, personal finance and consumer affairs. She's also an entrepreneur in her own right and founder of Business 111. And she's currently with the Institute of Directors, leading on small businesses and entrepreneurship. Okay, so as I'm involved in 2 business centres now, helping SMEs, I may be asking them for free advice. Liz McCone is, of course, a distinguished economist and statistician, and before joining the ONS, where she's a director of some major national statistics that we all look through to try and find out where we've been, and we've liked perhaps where we might be going. Anyway, she's held senior roles in government also, including chief economist at the Cabinet Office. So, like Joni Mitchell, she's looked at life from both sides now. And if you're too young to know who that is, you will have heard of David Bowie, who will of course introduce this session of revisions as, you've guessed it, which are changes. Anyway, thank you. And so Liz McCone, you're going to lead off with a job. Good.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andy. I think James has very usefully made a good case that if you look at it from the statistical system, the answer to the question of how important are revisions is a very clear, very important. But then if you look at it for users, and particularly I think for decision makers, they are very important, but we do see time and time again that they can cause concern, they can cause confusion, and they can cause consequence for the decisions that those users are making. And therefore, I think for someone like me and the National Statistical Institute, ONS, how we go about communicating, how we go about managing, and where possible and appropriate, where we go about minimising revisions becomes really, really important. So take those, expand on that thinking a little. We start on the statistical system, and I think this came through as James talked about revisions in the GDP context. You have this natural trade-off between timeliness and accuracy. You have decision makers who need decisions about, who need data to inform decisions quickly, and you have a complex £3 trillion economy where we only have full data available some years afterwards. The other distinction that I think came through in James's speech, which is really important when thinking about revisions, is that difference between new data coming through and actually bringing in new methods and new concepts. And we'll talk later on today and in other sessions about AI and how that might affect measurement in the future. But our understanding of the economy continues to evolve. And our need to make sure that our measurement is keeping pace with it is a big part of the revisions world. So I would kind of argue for a statistical system, sign of revisions is not a problem, it's a feature, not a bug, as was said in the earlier session, but it's a sign of a system that's responsive, self-correcting and open to new information. All sounds good in theory until I think that hits against how users are making use of our data and what revisions mean to them. And I think one of the challenges then in the revisions space, when we think about data uncertainty, is people kind of much more naturally connect to uncertainty about the future. We don't know what will happen tomorrow, so it's quite so that uncertainty feels easier to understand. Often when we're thinking about data uncertainty, we are looking back. How do we not know what the economy measured in Q1? And that uncertainty about what has happened about compared to what will happen, I think becomes quite a communication challenge. It's a kind of distinction between what we can't know, the future, and what we don't know yet, the past. And that it's in that landscape that we have to think about revisions. And we know that revisions cause the most challenge if they actually change the economic narrative and contribute to policy errors. And these two things together, I think, sort of bring out two lessons that NSIs need to think about. We need to address that challenge of communication, And we also need to manage and where possible minimise revisions. And we need to make sure our initial estimates are as robust as possible. And where there's increased or additional uncertainty in them, and the COVID period is probably a really good example of that, that we're being really clear and transparent about that increased uncertainty during those periods. So the actions that an NSI can take as a result, all of these are things that we think about a great deal at the moment, where we continue to try and make improvements, but we are very alive to the fact that there's more to do across the space. So thinking first of all about how we communicate revisions. So taking the example of GDP, there's a whole range of things we do. First of all, we very clearly communicate that first estimates are they're estimates. We provide a lot of information about revisions, both our policy on revisions, but also providing revision triangles and real-time databases so people can do analysis of those revisions, alongside an annual revisions article which looks back and provides a more analytical assessment of what's going on. It's possibly an opportunity to take a more systematic approach there across all of our economic statistics and review exactly what has been revised in the past year, why it's been revised, provide more information in that way, and that's something that we're giving some active consideration to. Management of revisions also matters. Revisions can provide useful signals in their own right. Persistent patterns in revisions can indicate systematic biases. They can point to areas where we can improve our statistics. And when we see things like that, we can actually make adjustments to the initial estimates, which is something that which we actively look at. A good example there is business investment, where early data returns to us tend to underestimate that and do so in a systematic way, so we can apply adjustments to initial estimates that can be removed later estimates as the data content comes through more fully there. A more recent example, and one that we're actively looking at the moment, is on the claimant count, where we have noticed over recent times a tendency for the initial number to be revised down by quite a regular amount each month. And so what we're in active discussion with DWP at the moment about whether we should be applying some sort of adjustment to that statistic to be aware of the data that reflects the data collection processes that go through that administrative system. And then the final sort of aspect I think that we think about from an NSI perspective is how can we minimise revisions? And that is how can we make the best possible initial estimate? And there is where new data sources and new methods can help us out a lot. And so some of the new data sources that can get us a richer picture sooner that we're actively beginning to make use of are things like financial transaction data, scanner data, and they can give us earlier reads on the economy, a richer and more accurate initial estimate, and minimise the revisions that would need to come later on. Concluding, revisions are really important. They're really important to us as a stats producer, so we can continue to bring in the latest data method concepts into our statistics. But how we communicate, manage and measure that matters for how users can make use of it. I think we've made progress on that, but there's still a way to go, and it's an area that we are actively giving our attention to.
Very good. And do you want to come in after this?
Yes, I'm Liz Mark II. Can I just ask who's in the room? Because I feel daunted by being surrounded by statisticians and economists. Is there anybody in this room who is from a business? Yeah, quite a few. That's good. Because I am, and I'm very glad you used the word to communicate 5 times, Liz, because communication is where my head is mostly at. I am a broadcaster, but over the years I've been working mostly with not SMEs, Andy, I'm taking you to task, small and micro businesses. And I think that that's an important distinction, because SMEs are where small, micro and medium-sized businesses all get lumped together and policymakers come up with one-size-fits-all policy. I'm very glad to see some nodding around the room. I have, over my 30 years in broadcasting, interviewed a lot of statisticians because I'm too stupid to understand the stats myself without the help of the statisticians. But I have interviewed a lot of economists, including Vicky Price, who's sitting in the middle of the room. And we always used to say as broadcasters, if we asked 40 economists, we'll get 40 different answers. And so I think the communication thing is really, really important for users, and that includes the businesses themselves, because the businesses are hugely dependent on a lot of the stats that are produced. And so the revisions are really important, but for me, the more revisions you have, to more of those statistical, the labour market force, for instance, GDP, etc., the more confusing the picture becomes for the small and medium-sized businesses that make up 99.2% of our population of businesses and employ 50% of the private sector workforce. So the more we can minimise those revisions, the better. When I think back to 2008, I was working on a midday programme for Radio 4, and the only person who ever opened the financial press in that department was me. And if I wasn't in the department on a day, the Economist, the FT, various similar publications were still in their plastic wrappers when I came in the following day. And what I was saying in the lead up to 2008, to that fateful day, when the Northern Rock queue precipitated the disaster that followed, was not being listened to by the powers that be, because the powers that be don't have the personal experience themselves of what is happening on the ground. And so if you've got an editor of a programme and you're trying to sell the fact that we're going to see a fundamentally important financial crash, very hard for them to understand what that means. And so the communication around about that is hugely, hugely important. And I remember having handed in my notice to the BBC. I was a freelancer, not an employee, running my own production companies at the same time, but handed in my notice to the BBC in the February, being asked to stay on because in the August this had happened, and there was nobody else in the department who had a clue what was going on. And I think that this is fundamentally an engagement that we need to really think about. What are the journalists thinking? We know an awful lot of things at very, very shallow depth. We're also very good at accepting what the last person has told us as being the gospel truth. Because we are looking across the whole spectrum, and we don't really know an awful lot at enough depth. So for us to have revisions upon revisions is a difficult one. So if I think back to 2008, I mean, there's no evidence that the ONS data caused the delay in the recovery, but there's certainly an argument to be said that there was a fundamental optimistic approach to the labour market figures that said they're not nearly as bad as we expected them to be, therefore things must be an awful lot better than they really have been predicted to be. But we weren't looking at who was working part-time when they didn't want to, who was being asked to go freelance, etc. We weren't looking at the nuances of the figures, and I think that was important, and the revisions came quite late. And so for me, to a certain extent, I have always wondered whether recovery in 2008 could have been a lot better managed if we'd had the stats much more quickly. And I'm worried about the same thing with COVID. I think when COVID hit, we didn't have enough stats on who was actually in the labour force, who was actually running businesses, particularly the micro businesses. A lot of those micro businesses that weren't registered as limited companies didn't get the help. So there was a lot of optimism around the amount of help, people on furlough, etc., etc. But 3.8 million micro businesses missed out on help. And that has had a fundamental knock-on to productivity today. But you add that to 2008, because 2008 hasn't resolved either that productivity issue. And now what I'm thinking about is, if I had the statisticians and the economists in the room, I'd be looking at those figures that came out on the population demographics this week from the ONS. How accurate are they? Are births really going to fall below deaths in 2026 as predicted? Because this is really, really important when you're looking forward. Is immigration going to peak at 230,000 net migration? Because all of that has got a huge play in to that future workforce coming down the track. And the NEETs figures is another thing that worries me. I want to know if they're accurate, because if they're underestimated, we're not going to have enough money going into the system in order to think about how we get them back into work and what programs are needed. If they're overestimated, then we could be throwing good money down the drain because we're coming up with programs that we don't really need. Now, I say this because there's an awful lot of micro businesses out there thinking about this already, and there's an awful lot of enterprise agencies out there thinking about this already. There's a lot of small business organisations. Ian Cass is in the room. He's chair of the Micro Business Alliance. A lot of the members of that alliance are thinking, what does this mean? What should we be doing? Should we be shifting our planning to deal with those needs? As a journalist, I only have W questions. I want to know what's going on. So Liz, if you come and be interviewed by me, what is going on, Liz? Why is it happening? I want to know. If I don't know what it is, we can't get to the bottom of it and the root cause of it. To whom is it happening? Is it happening to the big businesses, the small businesses, the medium-sized businesses that are often called the missing middle? Then, where is it happening? Is it happening all over the country, or is it regional or local? And think about our high streets. Our high streets, the data on our high streets, hugely important, but it's not the same all over the country. It depends on which region you're in. When is it happening? Is it happening over the short term, the long term? And then what are we going to do about it? As a result of all of this, how do we address those issues? What are we going to do about it? So as a journalist, those are the things that I'm always looking at. And I really want to know who has been affected by it. And if we only depend on the stats, we don't know what the human impact is. And to me, the human impact is really important. I live in Walthamstow, and Walthamstow is small business central. I love it. It is the most amazingly mixed area. But everybody runs a small business. We've only got Sainsbury's, Asda, and Nando's. The rest of them are small businesses. And I haven't seen the emptiness on the high street that I see in lots of other high streets. Why? Why am I not seeing that? Because a lot of those businesses have owned their properties for a long time. So they're not seeing their rents going up. They're now going to be affected by business rates going up. And that has come as a big shock to them. So they've not been able to factor that in. Are we now going to see, on top of additional NIC payments, the minimum wage increases and the pension contributions that come with all of that? Are we now going to see gaps appearing in that high street that we've seen in other high streets because rents have gone up and pushed people out already? Are we going to see our hospitality sector disappear completely because a lot of hospitality businesses have not been informed enough to be ready? And we need to be able to communicate why this matters to you, what is in this for you to know what is going on so that you can think about planning ahead. What are the wage increases going to look like? What are the business rate increases going to look like? And how do we plan ahead for that? Because frankly, the government needs to know how many micro businesses are going to be on the high streets like Walthamstow paying tax revenue. Because if the government doesn't know that, it doesn't know what's going to be available to pay into the public services. So there's a huge puzzle here. But we also need to know the impact of losing a business. And this morning's figures from Rathbones show that 1 in 5 micro small businesses are already making people redundant. Now, that's not showing through in the figures yet, because the last set of figures we had from the ONS unemployment showed that actually unemployment had dropped ever so slightly. So people are thinking, oh, unemployment's going down. Yet, if Rathbones are right, we're going to see unemployment going back up again. And the other statistic that caught me today, this is not just the ONS that needs real-time data. UK Finance came out this morning with stats that show debit card usage fell by 3.5%, while credit card usage went up by 3.6%. But that was in January. And I'm sorry, but this is May. And the debt advice sector is already seeing all of that feeding through, but their funding's being cut. So we just need much better real-time data, but we also need to know what the impact is. And the impact on mental health will be huge, and if mental health impact is huge, it's huge on the NHS as well. So I'm looking at this from an outlier. There's a big picture here. And we're all part of that bigger picture, and it's how the ONS stats can be more accurate. And I'm really pleased, James, to see how the system is going to be changed, because I think the closer we can get to that real-time data, the better it's going to be. But there's no point in telling a small business that inflation is running at 3.3%, because as far as they're concerned, it's running a lot higher. And I was told by the construction sector last week that inflation in the construction sector is running at anything between 6% and 20%. Now, they know that. They see that already. And we as statisticians, not me, you as statisticians and economists need to know that. So we need to be out there on those high streets, finding out for real what is actually happening. And Ian Cass is the man who can tell you later on this afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Very strong challenge for the ONS. That's very interesting indeed. I must admit, having come to business late in life, things I sort of lightly dismissed as transactions costs as an economist are really major obstacles, and we don't know enough about that. So I'm going to open for questions. Questions, not speeches, of course. And we start at the front. If you say who you are, please.
Yeah, Bernard Casey. I was interested in the very last presentation because it reminded me of something which I listened to quite a number of years ago when David Blanchflower was talking at Queen Mary College. And he was talking about walking around. Now, he was doing this at the MPC, so walking around was important at the Bank of England, or at least as far as David Blanchflower was concerned. And he pointed to other things like in the United States where there are these brown books, which are again the reports of walking around. So I suppose, is there an equivalent within the ONS, for instance, of a walking around? And the walking around is actually working two ways, because one of the ways you're walking around is picking up information, but one of the other ways when you're walking around is actually doing some of the explaining, which the first list talked about. That's actually how you communicate. Some of this communication is all well and good for a session like this, or to a session of statisticians, or a session of economists, but the people who you, Liz, too, are interested in are not reading and not understanding this thing at all. So
they haven't got time.
Okay, the question is, should statisticians and economists have dirty shoes? So,
Danny Blanchflower, one of my favourite economists, apart from Vicky Price, of course, absolutely walking around. But somebody else who taught me that, strangely enough, was Philip Green. And when I interviewed him for a book I wrote about him, he said the most important thing you can do is walk the walk. Walk the shop floor, walk the high streets, walk foreign high streets that have got really, when you're on holiday, go and look, go and see, go and bring it home, go and think about what's coming here next. Horizon scan in reality.
No, I agree with that. One of the things that we can do, which is really interesting, is actually go out with our field force, our interviewers, who obviously ask people all across the country. about what's going on, and that can be quite eye-opening for us. Seeing the data, and it also has that added benefit of seeing the data collection process at the front end and how that feeds through into our statistics at the end of the day. There's a couple of other related points I'll just pick up, which also relates to some of the things that Liz said about about real-time data and the different data that we draw in. It might allow me to give a plug for our dashboard on real-time data, which we launched recently, where we draw a lot of different data in. And one of the new features that we brought in a couple of weeks ago was more granular information on direct debit failure, looking at how that's varied by benefit recipient and income. Really interesting data, and that data is much more up to date. So that's given us a closer read on what's happening right now. Data is also useful when we come to do our curiosities and quality assurance around our main data, to have some of that read on more timely data. The other thing that we have access to that is our BIC survey, Business Insights and Conditions survey. So every fortnight, around 10,000 firms are telling us what it feels like on the ground. And that, again, at the moment, as we see, we're in a period of obviously of economic uncertainty, where how the Middle East events play out, we don't know yet, but we're getting a read every fortnight on how businesses are finding that, and that's really important at the moment as well. And in these periods of more uncertainty, some of that more real-time data becomes ever more important.
Which is really interesting to me, but my next question to you as a journalist would be, who are those 10,000 businesses that you're talking to? What's the makeup of them? Do they show the whole scope of sectors and regions and sizes and so on and so forth? Because that, to me, is extremely important, that we're reflecting the whole thing. And I think an awful lot of the micro business have been missing from the stats for quite a long time and not really seen within the statistical data, and I think that's important.
Okay, then Martin, we all know who you are, but you should say.
Well, Martin Wheel from King's College. All my experience of walking around, and when I was a member of the MEC, we used to go on business visits, was that you could predict what people had learned from their visits by the position they had before they went on the visit. In other words, it seemed to me to give quite a lot of opportunity to confirm people's prejudices. Of course, structured walking around is rather different, and that brings me to my question to Liz. Do you think micro businesses would be happy with an enhanced data collection burden so that there was a better image of what was happening to micro businesses?
No, of course not, because they haven't got time. They're too busily running a business. But also, they don't know what is in it for them. They don't know why it's important. The communication around about this has all been about these are the stats, but not what does it mean? How will it help you to decide what wages are going to look like? How much wages are going to go up? What skills you're going to be short of? They make decisions on all of that information if they've got it.
If the relevance of that, to those decisions was explained, they would be happy with a bigger data provision burden.
Some would, but the burden, we have to be extremely careful on the burden on micro businesses. I'm a micro business owner. At the moment, there's only 2 of us in a tech team. The tech team do what the tech team do. The 2 of us do the rest of it. If somebody sends me a great big long convoluted survey, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to fill it in. And that is part of the problem at the moment. I need 3 very simple questions that take me 3 clicks to be able to answer, that I can see those answers might feed into something that might be listened to, that might be to my benefit.
Okay, thanks. I think it's Kate next, Dame Kate Park.
Thank you. Compared to our university's superannuation scheme. I wanted to disagree with Martin just because it's about to do it. I'm sitting next to a John, but you can then disagree with me. I think Martin's probably right that we all carry our prejudices with us when we went on trips to the NTC. But I can say that they often led me to come back and look at bits of data with a different eye than I looked before. So they did change my mind at the level right. thinking. I also, when I was on the NPC, whenever I was paying for anything, I always asked the shop how busy they were, which is probably very annoying. Now you only have the opportunity to put your card down, you don't have time to ask them. So that piece of harmless information has been completely lost. I'm not expecting an answer, and it wasn't.
No, it's very good. Right, this might be the last question, Tony, I think, but if we want to come to say. But you can ask lots of economists, lots of opinion, but if you want the right answer, you ask Vicky Price. So,
I was going to say that actually the burdens on small businesses are coming anyway through the digital tax,
Yes.
which one is being forced to move to, which is, anyway, so if you add anything else to it, and I was just wondering, actually linked to the previous session, whether that is going to be helpful to the statisticians. I mean, are we having to do this to give more data or what's happening, or is it just for the HMRC to make sure that they collect more money? That's the question for the statisticians.
Yeah, I mean, we're always engaging with HMRC about how we can make the best use of their data and get more timely reads from it. So, yeah, that carries on.
Can I be really rude here and say that government works in silos and every silo wants its own bit of information collected in whatever way it wants it collected, and nobody's thinking, if we bring in MTD and now we bring in e-invoicing and we bring in whatever, how can we pull this all together so that the micro business isn't overburdened and can do everything through one place? We need to be thinking much better and smarter as to how we get that information.
that's very true. And yes.
Yes, Simon Briscoe. I just wanted to ask Liz version 1. There's all these new surveys and new data sources coming through, and I just wonder if the ONS or the government statisticians in general have got this sort of, I don't know whether it's intellectual bandwidth or the guts to embrace the concept that new data sources might show that the old data sources were giving a bit of a bum steer. You know, I look at the way that scanner data is being incorporated in CPI, the way admin data is being incorporated in population figures. It's all a bit half-hearted, you know, shoehorning new data into the old structures, where it might just be that the population numbers are wrong and the inflation numbers are wrong. So, you know, are you able to do that? Now, if I can just have one brief comment, I mean, Liz version 2, totally behind you, and I think the problem, I think, with the ONS is that, as James said earlier, they conduct whatever, 60, 70 surveys for GDP, dozens of others, no doubt, but the publication methodology of the ONS, I don't think has really changed in 30 or 40 years. It's the same old boring press releases. Why not merge this data and present it interactively in a way that people and companies can actually engage with it?
Take migration statistics, for example, which has moved completely away from the International Passenger Survey to administrative data. There was a shift in narrative when it did so. The importance is being able to explain as you change model, as you incorporate new data sources, how that's impacted the data, and being confident about that. And I think that's something that we've got to continue to challenge ourselves for. It's a good question to pose. And for statistical leaders, we've got to create this space where statisticians throughout the government statistical service have the confidence to take on new data. But I think that there are sort of specific examples where that has happened successfully, and on things like scanner data, we're at the early stages of exploiting its full value. And I think there's more that we can do, having established it well into CPI, to make greater use of it across the national accounts, and that's something we're actively pursuing. So there's always more that we can do in that space, but I think there's early signs on that. Likewise on dissemination, we know that there's more to do there. We're moving to a new website. But also how we interact across broadcast, across social media. I think that there's a lot of different channels which we communicate statistics that we didn't in the past. I think interesting findings that are coming through on the business engagement survey about playing data back to businesses more and in better and different ways, which we should be really open to. But I think in both cases there's a lot of thinking and early action on across both of those sides.
Can I just say one final thing? Can we please stop using proxies? Because we need to be talking to the real people on the real high streets, running the real businesses, because lived experience brings so much more information. Ian Cass has got his hand up and has had for a long time. Are you going to let him in, Andy?
You have to be quick, but to get back on time, but please do very quickly.
Micro businesses. I guess data and statistics are useful for different people. I'm just going to take on a point from this mentioned. Micro businesses now, the pace of change out there is so fast. You know, you've got kids going into university and talk computer language, and by the time they reach 4 years later, that computer language is defunct. You know, the drivers of AI, nanotechnology, robotics, we are in this fast-moving business. Micro businesses don't want a lot of detail now. What I need to be able to do, because most of them are reacting, moving, evolving so quickly, I'm just making the point that change means that most micro businesses, it's not ready, aim, fire anymore to get it perfect. It's ready, fire, aim, and you're constantly evolving and changing what you're going. So the information that a micro business owner needs is that give me a general sense of where the direction's going. I don't need too much detail. And if you give them that kind of information, you've probably got more chance of them engaging with you. But all this detailed, granular stuff, I'm afraid most micros, it's over my head. Not interested.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Revisions come too late.
Yes. Revisions take.
That's the last day. We can carry on over coffee. There's a lot to discuss, lots of challenges. We look forward to the coffee break then, which is now, I believe, Tony. So thank you.
My name is Jonathan Haskell. I'm here to introduce the next session, which is under the heading of the value of enterprise. I'm going to say a couple of words, and I'm going to pass over to Richard Hayes, who's sitting over there, who many of you will know. He's the Deputy Chief Economist of the ONS. And Ivan Gowan is sitting over there, CEO of Otago Limited, who are doing some fascinating work in this area. He will speak a little bit to that. And then Bernard Casey will say a few words after that, and then we'll throw it open for discussion. I want to show you just one slide. And this one slide is a slide which Tony Clayton and I were shown many years ago when we went to the Federal Reserve and had a meeting when they were working on this intangible stuff. And it is from this excellent research group called Ocean Tomo, who do the following. They take, on the left-hand side, they take the group of firms who entered the Standard & Poor Index in 1975, and they ask what fraction of their enterprise value could you explain by intangible assets, which are the kind of tan kind of lines, and tangible assets, which are the hatched open lines. And you can see that 83% of value is tangible for those types of firms. Scroll forward to 2025, been doing this for many, many years, Ocean Tomo, and ask that same question, and the fraction of firms' intangible value is now 92% for those new firms on the S&P Standard & Poor index. So I think that is a kind of a graphic demonstration, at least from the market valuation point of view, that intangible assets are very important assets for firms. So that's the background to the type of difficulties we want to understand when we value enterprises. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Richard Hayes, as say Deputy Chief Economist of the ONS. Richard, over to you.
I'm going to come up, I'm going to leave the same slide up because whilst I'm going to talk about technology, I'm definitely not going to attempt to use any. The question this poses is, this data poses, is essentially something that the international community of national statisticians, economic statisticians, have been considering and have been working on for some time. 13 months ago in New York, the United Nations Statistics Commission signed off the new statistics manual, the System of National Accounts, under which we use to measure this type of phenomenon, as well as the rest of national accounts and GDP. And within there, we have what I consider to be a moment of real opportunity in how we measure these intangibles and how we make sure that the statistics that James and Liz have talked about earlier today keep pace with this cutting edge, the frontier of what's happening within the technology sector and within the wider landscape of firms. Because, of course, this picture is not just a set of technology firms. This is absorption of this technology across all sectors. Within the S&A, we've agreed as an international community to really make two substantive steps. The first is to recognise the concept of data, the data that company holds as an asset in and of itself. This is a really big step, and for those of you who are on LinkedIn, you'll probably see that this morning the OECD Eurostat published a manual on how to statistically measure data so that countries can take that forward. Recognising data and the role that data plays across the technology and wider business landscape is increasingly invaluable. But of course, data in and of itself is not the new oil as it's sometimes described. It needs to be put with other technology. And the rising star on that landscape is artificial intelligence. The S&A recognised very much that 13, 14 months ago and in the preceding years, AI was coming, but there wasn't the depth of knowledge of what exactly it would look like. And I think we all recognise we're still only partway through that transition. But the S&A made space and made allowance such that as AI comes more into the mainstream, we have the capacity to absorb it and to recognise it within our data, rather than it becoming a factor that leaves our data out of date. Artificial intelligence, therefore, is recognised as a subset of the wider landscape of software. And James mentioned the system, the standard industrial classification, the SIC system that we have recently consulted on and published our results of the new industrial classification that we will be implementing through the Statistical Business Register. Within that, we've taken the deliberate step to identify AI within the software sector with a sub-industry of its own. Now, those of you who know anything about this sector know that the majority of generic AI development is happening in the US and China, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't future-proof the systems that we use so that if there is space in the UK economy for that to grow in the future, that we can accommodate it and understand it. Importantly, across all of this landscape, the UK is in a strong position. During the S&A process, we advocated for more types of intangible assets to be recognised within the S&A on the basis of the work that we've done for a great number of years. In fact, one of my predecessors, Tony Clayton, helped establish several years ago with Jonathan, where we actually run experimental extended accounts which cover the wider range of intangibles which don't sit within the national accounts at the moment. Using that as a base, it allowed us to argue that we should be more adventurous and include more of these. We weren't able to bring an international consensus on those, but I think it's a recognition that the UK, thanks to the investments we've been able to make over the years, are still at the forefront of how we measure these assets. Importantly, we therefore also pick up those data in some of our wider beyond GDP metrics. So our inclusive income estimates that we'll publish in November of this year will show the impact of some of those features. And we'll bring that data up to the 2025 vintage, closing some of the time lag that we've had in developing those. I'm going to say two final things about artificial intelligence because, as you all can probably easily imagine, this is not just going to be a case of a quick survey out to a lot of businesses to say, how much AI are you using? What's it worth? These are actually really difficult questions. I mentioned the fact that we have identified an industrial sector to allow us to capture the generic development of AI, but I think we already recognise and have enough information from UK businesses that the vast majority of what's happening in the AI sector in the UK is about embedding AI within existing technologies, existing products. And that, therefore, is going to be incredibly difficult to disentangle. You know, if AI is in your fridge product, which is telling you what you should buy and what's about to go out of date, that's going to be predominantly recognized within the manufacturing of refrigerators. It's not going to be something we're going to want to disentangle necessarily. In the same way that that fridge uses electricity, we don't try to disentangle the part of the fridge which is converting the electricity into cold into the electricity sector. So thinking about how we cover that and ensure we're adequately getting a picture of AI without misrepresenting what's happening in those existing industries is going to be very, very important. The second major challenge will be around pricing and working out the price of AI. Obviously, we use prices to deflate nominal values into volumes to allow us to produce the things like GDP. But these prices we know are going to be bundled. AI comes as part of an ecosystem. The companies that provide it are going to be charging you for the data center, the hardware, as well as the AI product. And so working out what of that charge that businesses are giving you is just the AI component is going to require some further methodological work that we're in the process of considering. Finally, we also need to think through the productivity impacts of once we've been able to assemble that data to understand how it has changed the way businesses are working. This is not just, however, a private sector problem. I'm going to finish with a shout out for our work on public sector productivity. Public services, technology is difficult to measure. Public services are also difficult to measure. And putting AI into public services just makes that challenge just a little bit harder for me. In 2023, we published the Public Service Productivity Review. Within that, and it shows the pace of change, we didn't really consider the potential impact of AI on the delivery of public services in great depth. We thought more about the outputs and the outcomes which are currently being delivered. So there's clearly an area there that we're going to need to think about. We published more data in that area in March earlier this year, which allowed us to break out policing and immigration for the first time to understand in a lot more detail what's happening within those important sectors of the economy. But all in all, I want to conclude by returning to the challenge and the size of this graphic so clearly delineates that, you know, the focus on this is something we continue to investigate alongside other statistical bodies around the world. We don't yet have all the answers, but we are working closely with a range of other international organizations and countries to share knowledge and to try and find the solutions to some of these challenges in as rapid a pace as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Can I pass over to Ivan Gowan, and we are going to seamlessly swap over the technology here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Richard. So just a bit of background on me. I'm a little bit intimidated by a room full of statisticians and economists. I've spent my career as a practitioner and studied computer systems engineering back in the 90s. And an MSc up at Edinburgh Uni with some exposure to neural networks back in 2000. I've spent a lot of my career at a company called IG where we built technology that automated large amounts of people's work. And we were an extremely scalable business. FTSE 250's top 2 most profitable businesses per employee, and I led the technology division, building out the platforms and systems that ran the business and provided the services to clients. So I've spent 15 years there. It was something where we automated customer onboarding, KYC processes, regulatory requirements, trading automation, straight through processing for clients, risk management, exposure management, and we lived through some of the crises that we heard about earlier. The 2008 crash was a massive market dislocation, and our systems needed to understand our clients' positions and our positions in the market within seconds. So the difference between the world I've been operating in and the world we're living in at the national level is huge. And that's really been the sort of my background. When I left IG, I went on and was CEO of a competitor called Capital.com, and we built a lot of similar systems. We also used AI, and this was in 2018, to understand the biases that people were exposed to in their investment decision making. And a large part of investment performance comes from how you feel about how you've done in the past, and whether you're following sentiment or whether you're counter trend, and how you deal with how your trades are going. So we used AI to analyze people's trading behavior, map that to well-established and published research on things that impact your bias, and this includes things like loss aversion and so on. Since leaving Capital, I've been working with David, Tony Hillier, and Mark Hillier as co-founders of Apagio, and I've spent the last 10 years helping startups, investing in startups, and helping people who are building startups to grow their businesses. And all of my career has been spent building assets that drive the balance sheet of firms. But none of the assets are on the balance sheet. And this is the big problem. And the Ocean Tomo slide is exactly the space that we're operating in. And there's a sort of a beautiful alignment here of what we're trying to do, and the work that has been done by Haskell and by Richard Hayes, and we're very familiar with your work. And you know, we're trying to bring a practitioner's lens on what is actually driving business growth. And so, you know, we're not constrained by the needs of the accounting system. We're not constrained by accounting's definitions of what an asset is. And that's a really important distinction, because a lot of intangible assets are not able to be separated and sold off in the case of a loan against that collateral, you know, coming due or not being satisfied, right? And this is really where the very big challenge is between what accounting looks at as an asset and therefore is part of the legal framework, and what we within, you know, the broader view of what's going on in the economy and what's driving growth, and then within the venture capital space and the private equity space, which is an area that I have more experience with than I do with the ONS. So this is something that is on the UK data side, and the good work that's been done by people on the panel here, to try to quantify, you know, when the UK's balance between investments in tangible and intangible flipped, and that's, you know, more than 20 years ago. I think it was 1998 that flipped. These show the composition of UK intangible investment as we understand it. The firm level picture is not very clear. And we've spent quite a long time, and by long time I mean a number of years, talking to founders of SMEs. And we started off talking to founders talking about productivity. And when you talk about productivity at a national level, I think it has quite a different connotation in the minds of business people when they're thinking about productivity. And I think if you go and talk to an executive about their productivity, they don't think about capital productivity. And capital productivity is what drives a lot of the growth. People are building assets that drive growth in organizations. They're all intangible, right? 90% of growth is coming from intangible assets. And yet they're not assets on the balance sheet, and people don't think about that as capital productivity. And when you talk to SME owners, they think of productivity as, you know, my meetings, my emails, my inbox, you know, sort of labor productivity at a very basic level. They're not very sophisticated in their understanding of how it's measured, what it means. Most people don't, and this is 29%, don't track it at all. Many have KPIs that are there to monitor individual departments, but with a lack of standardization and often with a lack of common way of rolling it up to the top level of the organization. There's some other stats on here which I think are fairly self-explanatory. I think this third point here about being 38th, the recent papers published by the UK RI about understanding that the UK is very good at innovation. And where we've struggled more is scaling those innovative businesses. And Innovate UK are moving this year towards narrowing their focus on the scale-up community, because businesses that scale will create many more jobs. And the UK disproportionately does very well in innovation and not so well in creating global leading technology firms. And this is where a lot of growth and high value jobs are created. How are we trying to contribute? CHS is a standard that was put together 20 years ago and has been updated. And in the last 20 years, technology has evolved enormously. And within technology, as I've been exposed to it, and as we see in the businesses that are raising capital and growing, we've tried to model that from a practitioner's point of view to show what's important to organizations and executive teams that they have within their business that has a taxonomy that goes beyond what is in CHS and what is in accounting standards. And we've come up with this Apagio 12 set of value drivers that we believe management do manage, but we don't have a common way, a common classification and taxonomy to be able to recognize it in a standard way across organizations. And some of these are fairly new. So the network effects and platforms, ecosystems and partnerships and switching costs and lock-ins are all things when we talk about them, we sort of understand. You know, I'm here on an Apple MacBook, I have an Apple phone, I use the Apple App Store, my kids have Apple phones, they have iPads. Now, that as an asset for Apple is not on their balance sheet. That as a strategy for Apple is absolutely front and center. And I've got friends who are senior at Apple and you know, they're very clear on internal strategy here, right? The iPhone is the beachhead. You buy an iPhone and that's the entry into the Apple ecosystem. The switching costs to get off Apple once you're on it are high, right? If we were to go around the room, I'm being asked to accelerate here. Sorry, I'm dragging the content here. The main point here is we've got a new taxonomy. We believe it's fairly complete, but it's fairly new too, so we're very open to feedback and input from industry and experts. It maps to the CHS categories. So in our system of classification that helps businesses identify their intangibles, it maps one-to-one directly from our taxonomy into the way that CHS is modelled. Last point, very quickly, and maybe I'll just leave this up here and we can move to discussions. AI is creating new intangibles. These are the intangibles within AI businesses. the impact of AI on the intangibles within other businesses is huge. And we're at the forefront of the disruption. We've all used ChatGPT like for conversational AI and answers. Where we're heading to is leading organizations are running departments with AI running the department. And that is going to happen, and it's happening with small numbers of firms that are going to lead this trend. And agentic AI is getting rolled out widely. Augmented work AI is getting rolled out widely. The businesses of tomorrow are going to be solo founders running large organizations without many paid employees.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I think great. And just to finish off this session, Bernard is just going to take a couple of minutes.
I'm an economist rather than a statistician, but I want to talk about some work that has been done together with Apagio and together with David Stroll, who is sitting at the back and is waving his hand around, where we've actually been trying to look at a particular firm that Apagio has been trying to draw data from to put into its model. And we are looking at a particular firm in a particular industry, and you will see on, I think it's the left-hand side of this, you will see some very basic descriptors of what this firm was doing. And we were looking at productivity because that's what we're looking at. And you can see what sector the firm comes from, and you can see that the firm actually seems to be performing pretty well across compared to the rest of industry, but not much better than the specific industry it comes from. And you can see some of the things which happened in this firm in the recent post-COVID years. That's the right-hand side, and that's the period which we try to concentrate on extracting data from the management accounts of the company, that we could actually construct indicators of performance. And particularly we were interested in productivity, and we were interested in the first instance in productivity as commonly described, which is simply productivity output per worker, or possibly output per worker hours. Some of this data, certainly on the left-hand side, is compatible with the kind of work which Josh Martin had been doing. So we tried to standardize it and make it comparable to what he was doing as well. But what I want to show also, or perhaps I should show one thing. You can actually see, if you look at the metrics of things that were contributing to output, you can see that this firm actually kept labour numbers absolutely constant over the period. There was a substantial, however, increase in capital investment, but that capital investment was tangible capital, not intangible capital. So what we tried to do was we tried to pick apart what contributed to performance in this firm over that period. This very great increase in productivity alongside what appeared to be a big increase in capital, tangible capital investment, but what was happening otherwise. And we engaged in an exercise and those of you who are economists will understand this, and I'm not going to explain it to non-economists, but we tried to decompose a thing called the Solow residual, which basically says what contributed to this large growth in output over the years. How much was contributed by labour, how much appeared to be contributed by capital, and how much was contributed by this wonderful thing called total factor productivity, which, as you can see across the top, is the ability to generate income from inputs, doing more with less, or basically how to be innovative. So we got out the contribution of labour, we got out the contribution of capital, and we got out the contribution of total factor productivity, the thing which everybody says is terribly important for growth. And we had two models. We had a very simple model, which actually just said, okay, we've got so many units of labour. Those units of labour actually stayed constant. And the first column of the left-hand table shows you the very simple model. The second line of that table shows you what happened if we actually looked not at the number of workers, but whether the number of workers were actually somehow better organised and more highly skilled. And we were able to take out from the data the extent to which that happened. So that's what we call augmented labour. We've now got a number of labourers but working properly. And you can see that the total factor productivity declines as a consequence. We've gone from 58 to 33%. So actually looking at the way labour is being used and how skilled it is important. And then we tried to look at this. What actually contributed to the total factor productivity growth itself? This thing which everybody is concerned about. Again, we break it down. If you look at it on a simple model, you can see that the growth of total factor productivity was quite large over this relatively limited period. If you take account of the fact that actually labour was better skilled, better organised, the contribution to total factor productivity growth seems to decline. So in other words, what we're saying is that a substantial proportion of the increase in total factor productivity growth over time, about 58%, was to do with skilling the labour better and organising it. That is a substantial, that's an intangible, it's a very concrete example of an intangible, and it's also an unmeasured intangible because you don't find this anywhere in the company book. 58%, nearly 60% of the increase in total factor productivity seems to come from one point. It still leaves the question of where does the other 40% come from? We have ideas about this. David, who knows the company, Ivan, who knows the company, if you want to ask some questions about where this comes from, you have to ask them. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. Let me throw it open. In that case, I'm going to go 5 minutes into lunch break because we started a little bit late. Why don't I start with Tony Clayton over there?
Thanks very much. I'm Tony Clayton, an earlier edition of Richard, 20 years ago, now retired. And I chair one local council on Benford. And I'm really interested to hear that you're looking at this issue of intangibles in the public sector. Because I don't see it anywhere in the councils I work in. If you ask anybody in our accounting function or even in our management function, what they thought intangible assets had done for them, they wouldn't have a clue. And this is really important because we're about to completely change the structure of these councils. And the risk when you re-engineer organisations is you lose the intangible assets. So I'd be interested to know a little bit more about what you're doing in the public sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Let's collect a few more questions, please.
I myself earlier, John Bryan, who is now retired, and one of my main preoccupations is I manage my own pension fund through a SIP, and therefore I am following the markets a great deal. And the biggest intangible in terms of the value of publicly quoted companies is simply investor confidence in them, because we have things like momentum shares that suddenly blossom as all the retail investors around the world like me suddenly get excited about one particular share and it doubles in value. But the company itself is still doing the same stuff and it's still producing, and maybe increasing slightly per year, but it's investor confidence which is boosting the value of the share. And eventually, of course, it collapses again. And it's predicting when it collapses is the key for investors like me to make sure you don't get caught. But that is an intangible, is actually investor confidence in the company is an intangible which is not properly measured.
Thank you. Right at the back.
Jonathan White, so a question for Ivan. You outlined the schism between the accounting definitions of intangibles and your definition, and I just wonder what engagement you've had with the professional accounting bodies like the ICAW, etc., and what your experience of that engagement was, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important question, which I know the national accountants worry a lot about the relationship with the company accountants as well. That was three. I'll take one more and then I'll go back to the panel.
Sean Richards, and my question is for Ivan, please. Firstly, when you showed the slide that had 85 billion higher investment if you put the intangibles in, can you answer how much of this is in GDP as it's currently measured, how much isn't? And secondly, related to the question we were just asked, I noticed when you said not constrained by accounting definitions, but then to use Tony Dent's point from earlier, if you don't use the ruler or the tape measure, how do you measure it?
Why don't I pass over to Richard in the first instance to say some words about the public sector issues and financial markets.
Thank you. The public sector, I think we probably share a common view that we're on the cusp of seeing artificial intelligence being used there rather than actual application at the moment. But during the reviews that I mentioned, two things that we did was to extend our time use survey to have a specific way focused on public sector workers to understand what activities they were doing in their roles. And also looked at what managers' views were in terms of what they felt was holding back productivity or supporting productivity in their area. And within that, we see probably the things we expected to see. That for workers, the balance of doing their frontline activity versus administrative tasks that were not directly related to delivery. You want a nurse to take some notes. You want a doctor to take some notes. You don't want to class that as admin and then drive down and reduce that, because that will impact the quality of the service. But you might not want the nurse doing a lot of reporting about workforce numbers. Looking at the balance of that was important. Within the survey we did of managers, I think the thing that we really identified was something around the burden of ad hoc requests, which slow down their ability to plan and to systematize delivery of services, and the impact that that had on productivity. So I think those are areas that I would imagine we're going to increasingly see the public services want to tackle with tools as they become available. Just on one of the questions that was directed to Sean about the share of intangibles within the national accounts, I'll just step in.
I think it would be better for you to take that question.
Fine.
Yeah.
So what we see from the experimental series we publish is that at the moment, as Jonathan mentioned, the intangibles, the total stock of intangibles that we estimate, those within the national accounts and those not, exceeds tangible investment. And we think broadly just over half of all intangible investment isn't captured within the national accounts, but that's why we focused on getting those numbers published, to make that visible and to support people to understand them. Importantly, however, when one thinks about the complete capital stock of the country, many intangibles have a far shorter life. So even though there's more investment in them, they don't last half as long as buildings and roads and bridges and these sorts of things, and therefore the capital stock is still predominantly tangible, but that balance is slowly changing through time.
Thanks, Richard. Ivan, do you want to take this difficult issue about the gap between management accounts and between company accounts and the type of accounting that you're doing?
Yeah, so it's a really difficult problem, and we don't sidestep it. What we do is we map our intangibles structure, which is quite a deep taxonomy. We've gone down to more than 8,000 individual asset types. And we have an allocation of each one where it maps to existing accounting IFRS, IAS 38 regulations. And we incorporate the need for GAAP and non-GAAP. So it's quite a complicated mapping process. But organizational capital and human capital are just not going to exist on a sort of accounting lens of a business. And this gets incorporated in the M&A world and in fundraising, in accounting, all under this thing called goodwill. And we are trying to identify in a common way the makeup of goodwill. That's really what it comes back to, right? And there are accounting rules whereby intangibles are allowed to go on the balance sheet in some cases when acquired, but they're not allowed to go on the balance sheet when you build them internally. And there are very large knock-on consequences for tax if you were to capitalize some of the assets that you're building internally and amortize them over a 5 or 10 year period. And I spent my life at IG with a fairly large budget in software engineers. At one point it was more than £10 million a year. And none of that was capitalized, it was all OPEX. And more than 50% of what that 10 million a year was doing was building new products for the future. New products and services for our existing clients, new products and services for new territories, new products and services to launch new businesses. So, you know, all of that is coming off the P&L. This is the same problem that startups face. This is the same problem that companies face when they're at Series A and they're getting their first institutional round of investment, and they're trying to justify a valuation that values all the work they've put into identifying a problem and coming up with a solution, and they haven't yet got the cash flows. And this is where AI will accelerate people who have got good ideas, getting further down the proof of concept, the working prototype, to be able to raise capital with less money needed up front to do the early stage evaluation, trialing, testing, getting early product market fit. So, you know, early adopters of AI that are using to build these companies are going to accelerate, and we're going to see quite a big shift in dynamics there. So, to go back to the accounting standards, you know, it's not our job to try to influence the accounting standards, and there are very good reasons why lots of intangibles can't be defined in accounting terms to allow them to be separable. I'll throw one example out there which sort of came to light when I was at IG. When Facebook launched its IPO back in 2012, it listed at a share price of $38, and it was very polarizing. All the financial press said this is a ludicrous valuation. How on earth can you support that valuation? Because they're looking at the accounts. All of Silicon Valley and VC investors said this is an amazing company. They're growing at an enormous rate, and their cash flows are going to be huge in the future. And the IPO was one of the big coming together of the two schools of thought. And on launch, the trading activity was so wild that the NASDAQ could not open the market. There's an auction process that goes on at the start of market day to establish where the price is going to open. The price variance was so wide, it delayed the launch of the first ticked price published by more than 20 minutes. It's pretty unheard of. Literally pretty unheard of. So that's how polarized the market was, right? That's how mispriced intangibles are in the public markets. To your point about sentiment, this is a really important point, right? And so, you know, and then you take another example within the Facebook story, which is illuminating. Does anyone know how much they paid for Instagram?
Hell of a lot.
$1 billion. Does anyone know how many employees Instagram had? 13. Does anyone know how much revenue Instagram had?
0, no.
0. So why did they buy it for $1 billion? Comes back to the intangibles. They're acquiring a potential competitor. They're acquiring a new route to their advertising streams that they were already building and successfully monetizing within Facebook. They're acquiring a different demographic of customer, which was a younger demographic who didn't like Facebook. So the intangibles they were buying for a huge amount of money were valued in Silicon Valley. And they were laughed at. And, you know, Facebook share price now, yesterday it was at $611, which is 16 times its listing price 14 years ago. and it went down as low as $16 after it listed at 38. So, you know, the mispricing of intangibles is there in the public markets as much as it is in national accounts.
I'm going to give Bernard a chance just to say a quick word, and then I'll go to Sanjeev for a final question before lunch, and then we'll go to lunch. Go ahead, Bernard.
Yeah, on the accounting standards and what financial rules sort of say for standard accounting standards, this is something which David and I argued about an awful lot when we were actually putting data together to do what I was talking about. But it became a very interesting story, and what Evan was saying was very important indeed. Who is looking at what, why, for what purposes? And maybe the first thing you do is you look at the reported books, but anybody who's actually going to do some intelligence has actually got to do something rather closer to what Evan was talking about there. David and I had an interesting question which we didn't resolve in the end, and we decided to leave alone. But if that applies to the individual firm, it also applies to the economy as a whole. And therefore, if one is trying to look at what and the way in which the UK economy is behaving, the same sort of questions actually seem to arise, because the firm which Ivan is talking about is dependent upon strangers willing to invest in it. The UK economy is also dependent upon the kindness of strangers, as somebody said. And if the UK economy is dependent upon the kindness of strangers, maybe if one investigates the UK economy in the same way as one possibly should be investigating the firm, because we don't know about all these things which we have been told about ought to be there, maybe the strangers will view us in different ways, not just an individual company, but the economy as a whole.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Quick question from you, Sanjeev.
Thanks.
And you should tell everybody, Sanjeev, who you are.
Sanjeev Mahajan, I work in the Office for National Statistics. For Evan, there's two particular aspects I had. The accounting issue I was going to raise has been done. First one is, if you take tangibles, intangibles, market sentiment, expected future earnings, etc., there's still a gap between that and market capitalisation. What's your view on that gap? And secondly, you mentioned that there's a lot of innovation, but it's not necessarily creating a conversion expectation into jobs. Do you think some of that is outside the UK, because those jobs and the creation of production of outputs, etc., is much cheaper? Is there anything in what you've done that explains why the job creation element hasn't come through the same way as the innovation?
Thank you, Sanjeev.
Two complicated questions. The thing about the valuation, a new set of guidelines published last year, which have been adopted by more than 40 countries, called the IPEV, and they are trying to address this problem of how do we improve the standardization of valuing private equity companies. And we're seeing a trend of very large market capitalization businesses coming to the public market much later in their growth. And we'll all be familiar with the very recent, I'm tempted to say outrageous package that Elon Musk is looking to put together for his planned upcoming listing and consolidation of his various businesses. And I mean, the figure that I think is correct is $1.75 trillion is what he is hoping to list this collection of businesses for. And within that, he's got some outrageous goals for generating 100 times the current US power production within space. And that's one of a number of ambitious goals that he will get an enormous payout if he lands. And to your point about sentiment, you know, Musk is the, I guess, the person who has promised the most radical change and has been afforded a huge multiple on his underlying financials, which is cheap access to capital, as a result of what one might say is a combination of big vision, bravado, and BS. Right? And that is forming an outrageous multiple. And whether he can close that gap by delivering on the steps that he wants to will be something judged by the market. I've seen some good analysis on this latest listing that he wants to push through that is suggesting, this is going to be carried by retail, and a lot of institutional money is saying, these valuations are way too high. He's got to grow at phenomenal rates just to justify the current valuation, and we know he's losing huge amounts of money through his XAI piece in the middle of this collection of businesses that he's wrapping up. So I think that problem of what is the multiples is trying to be addressed through some guidelines to give asset managers and people who are running investment funds, private equity holding companies, giving them some guidelines, giving them some audit points, giving them some well-defined structures for how they go about declaring the makeup of their valuation approach and governing the change to valuation, right? And putting in audit points, putting in checks and balances, making sure that when that comes in and is assessed, there's a traceability there. And there's a lot of complication in that space with a lot of vested interests and potential conflicts of interest, which they're trying to put some governance around. And the FCA has been very active in reviewing the guidelines and coming up with some recommendations there.
Okay, great. We can carry on this discussion over lunch, and thank you to all of the speakers.